Imagine being just 17 years old. You leave your home forever. You travel hundreds of miles to marry a man you've never met. And within hours of arriving in England, you discover that your new husband is already losing his mind. This is the extraordinary story of Queen Charlotte, the woman history remembers as the devoted wife of King George III, the queen who stood beside a king during Britain's greatest triumphs and darkest crises. But behind the glittering palaces and royal ceremonies lay a marriage filled with loneliness, heartbreak, and sacrifice. And by the end of her life, the man she loved would no longer even recognize her. This is the tragic true story of Queen Charlotte. Charlotte was born on May 19th, 1744, in the tiny German duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Compared with Europe's great kingdoms, Mecklenburg-Strelitz was small, poor, and politically unimportant. Charlotte grew up far from the glamour of major royal courts. Her childhood was quiet. She received a traditional education focused on religion, music, languages, and household management. No one expected this young German princess to become one of Britain's most important queens. But in 1761, everything changed. King George III of Great Britain had recently inherited the throne. He was only 22 years old. Unlike many previous British kings, George wanted a respectable Protestant wife. Charlotte seemed perfect. She was intelligent, she came from a good royal family, and she had no dangerous political alliances. Negotiations moved quickly, so quickly in fact that Charlotte had never even met George. At just 17 years old, she was told she would become Queen of Great Britain. Her entire life changed overnight. In August 1761, Charlotte said goodbye to her family. She would never see many of them again. The young princess began the long journey to England. After arriving at St. James's Palace in London, she met George III for the very first time. Only hours later, they were married. Imagine that, meeting your future husband for the first time on your wedding day, and discovering that you are now queen. Fortunately, George and Charlotte quickly developed genuine affection for one another. In an age when royal marriages were usually political arrangements, theirs became something rare, a real partnership. George adored Charlotte, and Charlotte devoted herself completely to her husband. Together, they would have 15 children. 15. Their family life fascinated the British public. The king and queen appeared respectable, moral, and devoted. For many Britons, they represented the ideal royal family. But trouble was already approaching. Charlotte's early years as queen coincided with one of Britain's greatest crises. Across the Atlantic, Britain's American colonies were becoming increasingly rebellious. Tensions grew. Protests erupted. Then war began. The American Revolutionary War would transform world history. Throughout the conflict, Queen Charlotte remained publicly loyal to her husband. As king, George III became the symbol of British authority. In America, many revolutionaries blamed him personally for their grievances. His image was burned. His name was condemned. Eventually, Britain lost the war. The United States became independent. For George, the loss was devastating. For Charlotte, it meant supporting a husband carrying the burden of imperial defeat. But an even greater tragedy awaited. In 1788, something terrifying happened. King George III became seriously ill. He behaved strangely. He talked endlessly without stopping. He suffered confusion, agitation, and emotional instability. Sometimes he became impossible to control. Doctors were baffled. No one understood what was happening. Today, historians still debate the cause. Some believe George suffered from a mental illness. Others suggest a physical condition, such as porphyria. Whatever the cause, the consequences were heartbreaking. Charlotte watched helplessly as the man she loved changed before her eyes. During his episodes, George could become unpredictable. At times, Charlotte was even advised to stay away for her own safety. Imagine the agony. Your husband is alive, but slowly becoming someone you no longer recognize. As the king's condition worsened, politicians argued about who should rule. Would the Prince of Wales become regent? Would Britain face a constitutional crisis? For months, the entire nation anxiously waited. Eventually, George recovered, for a while, but the illness would return again and again. Each episode became harder for Charlotte to endure. Despite these struggles, Queen Charlotte remained remarkably active. She loved music. She supported composers. One young musician she famously met was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart performed before the royal family while still a child. Charlotte also became an important patron of the arts and sciences. She encouraged education. She took an interest in botany. Her enthusiasm helped expand the royal botanical collections at Kew. Today, Kew Gardens remains one of Britain's most famous landmarks. Charlotte was also deeply devoted to family life. Unlike many previous monarchs, George and Charlotte preferred spending time with their children. They often withdrew from London's glittering social scene. Some courtiers found the royal couple dull, but ordinary people admired their domestic image. To the public, they appeared stable, respectable, moral. Yet behind palace walls, the Queen lived with constant anxiety. Would the king remain well, or would the darkness return? By 1810, George III's illness had become permanent. The king suffered a devastating mental collapse. This time, there would be no recovery. Parliament officially appointed the Prince of Wales as Prince Regent. George III would never rule again. For Queen Charlotte, the emotional toll was immense. She could no longer live a normal married life. Visits between husband and wife became increasingly rare and carefully supervised. The king's condition had deteriorated so severely that seeing him often caused Charlotte profound distress. Imagine loving someone for nearly 50 years, only to lose them while they are still alive. Many historians believe these final years were among the saddest of Charlotte's life. She continued performing her public duties, but privately she was grieving, not for a husband who had died, but for one she had already lost. Queen Charlotte spent her final years increasingly withdrawn from public life. Age and illness began affecting her own health. Yet she remained an important figure within the royal family. By now, Britain itself had changed dramatically. The nation had survived wars with revolutionary France and Napoleon. Industry was transforming society. A new century had begun. Charlotte had witnessed extraordinary events: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, and throughout it all she had remained queen. On November 17th, 1818, Queen Charlotte died at Kew Palace. She was 74 years old. Her husband, King George III, survived her. But because of his illness, historians believe he may never have fully understood that she was gone. 2 years later, George himself died. Their marriage had lasted nearly 57 years. One of the longest royal marriages in British history. Today, Queen Charlotte remains one of Britain's most fascinating queens. Some remember her as a devoted wife. Others remember her patronage of music, science, and the arts. Modern discussions have also explored questions surrounding her ancestry and representation in history. But perhaps Charlotte's greatest legacy was her loyalty. She stood beside her husband through war, political crisis, public pressure, and devastating illness. She sacrificed much of her own happiness to support both king and country. Behind every crown lies a human story, and Queen Charlotte's story is one of love, duty, and extraordinary endurance. History often remembers kings, the battles they fought, the empires they ruled, but sometimes the most powerful story belongs to the person standing beside the throne. Queen Charlotte arrived in Britain as a frightened teenage princess. She died as one of the longest-serving queens in British history. She witnessed triumph. She endured tragedy, and through it all, she never abandoned the man she had promised to love. Even when the world around them fell apart, even when he no longer recognized her. And perhaps that is why, more than 2 centuries later, Queen Charlotte's story still moves us today.